Okay, hi everybody, I'm David Mallery. I'm a second year PhD student from York University, and that's in Toronto. I'm going to be talking about epistemological complexity, and I was asked to talk about methodological pluralism in ecological economics, and how I believe these things are all related. Now, I myself come to ecological economics as a systems theorist first, and an ecological economist second. And I think that that's appropriate because, as Joe pointed out, we use complex systems theory a lot in our work. But also because our sort of provenance in ecological economics is very much owed to systems theory. A lot of our sort of founding minds in ecological economics were involved in complexity science before there was ever such a thing as ecological economics. And I would point to Boulding and Odum as two good examples of people who were presidents of then the Society for General Systems Research, before ecological economics came along. So I think that these two disciplines are intimately related, and I think that you can't talk about the history of one necessarily without the history of the other. So since this is for, okay, so this image, let me explain this first. This is from Robert Natto's article in Scientific America, and this explains the history of ecological economics. And it's called "The Economist Has No Clothes." So because this session is for newcomers to ecological economics, I'll tell you that our sort of founding criticism of neoclassical economics is on the fact that it's based off of physics. And how many people in this room knew that? Quite a few didn't. So that absolutely blew my mind when I first learned that around that time that the neoclassicists, and we're talking about people like Walras, and Jevons and that sort of group of economists were thinking, they literally took the models from Ludwig von Helmholtz that were physical models, and they erased the physical variables and they put in economic models. And this was the basis of the models that are used in neoclassical economics. So some of the features of some of the assumptions made in neoclassical economics, and diminishing marginal utility being one of them, were made because they were trying to fit the physical model. They weren't made necessarily because they believed those things. They were made because they were compelled to make that assumption in their model as well in order to make them correspond with one another. And before I go any further, I just want to remind you of something that Hayden King said today that I thought was very profound. The first thing that he said to us is that in his culture, the cosmology is encoded into their language. And this is something that is universally true. And the way that we think, our ways of seeing, our ways of thinking, and our ways of being are intimately related with one another. And these are fixed in self-reinforcing cycles. In the case of neoclassical economics, this idea of this protean energy force leading everything towards equilibrium in the assumptions is something that came from physics, and it was encoded in that kind of reductionist deterministic mindset. So these ideas are, if you will, they're encoded into the grammar of economics from physics. And we know that this failed, but we don't often talk about why it failed. And I think that that's important. Economics, like the economists, weren't the only ones to be doing this at the time. This was very common at the time. We think of it today as being physics. There was a lot of enthusiasm around physics at the time, and we would see this in biology and chemistry and all of these other sciences. And they believed that everything could be reduced to physics. And this came out of the incredible technological and scientific successes of physics at the time. And it's associated with the idea of Laplace's demon. If you have enough information, then you'll be able to calculate what happens in the past and the future. Where am I on this? Oh yes, so a good example of that is the planet Uranus. So we discovered Uranus without ever having observed it. We mathematically determined that it must be there. And so we knew that there was a planet because of the shifting of the gravity and the other planets and the wobbling. And so eventually it was observed, and this was the sort of apotheosis of physics, and the enthusiasm came from that. Another example of this sort of deterministic mindset affecting the world we live in is capitalism. Because I don't know if anyone's familiar with the work of Max Weber. Max Weber wrote a book called The Spirit of Capitalism and the Protestant Ethic. And in this, he's looking at Calvinism, which at the time was an ascetic sort of branch of Protestantism. And it was associated with a lot of the educational systems that were coming up in the States at the time. And Calvinism has this belief of like predetermination, predestination, which was quite related to this idea of physics of determinism, and the idea that capital, the accumulation of capital, was simply evidence that you were favored in the eyes of God. So these things, this reductionism, determinism, are intimately related to capitalism. Let me see, where am I? So the issue is that physics, and by extension, our neoclassical economics, is not necessarily better or more explanatory than other sciences or other cosmologies or other heuristics. We know that we can't reduce biology to physics. That fails. And the reason for that is because physics looks at a very reduced sort of subset of what reality is. It looks at simple systems. And by that I don't mean that physical systems can't be incredibly complicated, but they're not complex. Like, complicated systems are still simple, but a complex system is a different thing. So all of our speakers this morning talked about complex systems, and we often talk about complex systems in ecological economics, but we don't really talk about what that means. What does complexity mean? And one of the reasons for that, coming as a systems scientist to you guys, is because there's a lot of different definitions of what complexity and what systems are. But I'll give you the easy ones. The easiest answer is that a complex system is when the whole is more than the sum of its parts. That's probably the easiest definition you can give. Another approach to complexity, so as an example of that, if you take plants in a wetland, there will be more evapotranspiration with the plants in the wetland, synergizing with one another, than if you take them out and you put them in plants and put them in a lab. How does that happen? Well, through synergy, through feedback, and through all of these things. But another approach to complexity is associated with the idea of epistemological complexity. That when we encode our models of our observations of the world, we're necessarily making, where's Sam? Political decisions. And this is something else that Max Weber believed. So the natural system is anything that we can interact with and see and measure in sort of the ambience of reality. And the formal system is a formal system of logic and axioms, essentially. We have to encode the semiotic categories of the system, and semiotics has to do with what's meaningful about the system, and we have to encode the syntax. And then when we decode it, we are effectively testing reality to see if it correlates to our ideas about what the system should do. And we're also changing reality, so we're entraining reality with our ideas about it, but not totally. Now, natural systems are governed by causal entailment, like natural law. Formal systems are governed by inferential entailment, so that's if-then statements, right? So that's abstract logic. There's nothing that entails that. There's nothing that governs that. That's a free creation. And that involves art, that involves your assumptions, that involves values, that involves your culture, that involves politics. This is why Weber said that science is a political vocation. And even more so when you're decoding and you're changing the world around you. So this is epistemological complexity, which is like the Hindu parable of the blind men touching the elephant, right? So 5 minutes, perfect. So all of these men are blind and they're trying to describe the elephant and they all find something different because they can't see the whole thing. This guy sees a spear, this guy's touching the trunk, so he sees a snake, this guy is touching the ears, so I guess he feels window drapes, and you get the idea. And I think this is an elegant sort of explanation of what complexity is. The complexity of something is a function of how many non-equivalent descriptions we can make of the same thing. So orbital motion is a simple system. You can explain that with Newtonian physics, and it works great. And you can put a man on the moon, and you can do amazing things with it, but you can't use it to explain socio-ecological systems. Way too complex. Like it's just not going to work, and you can't create an economics which is going to explain everything for you. And this is associated with postnormal science and when it's appropriate to do which. So sending somebody to the moon. Well, applied science worked for that. Actually, like technology worked for that. There wasn't even a lot of science involved in sending somebody to the moon. That was mostly technology. But when system uncertainties and decision states increase, then you need professional consultancy, you need specialization. That's when you go to the surgeon or the senior engineer. Sorry. When you cross a certain threshold there, you get into the realm of postnormal science, and that's when you have to do the opposite. That's when you have to use multidisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity. You need to take a lot of different models, and you need to put them next to each other, and you have to integrate them, and you have to do it at multiple scales of analysis. And this is what we should be doing in ecological economics. This is what a lot of ecological economists point to as our sort of scientific approach. And I apologize, I didn't put references on this, but when I posted it online, I will. This is by Zora Kovacic, who's at the Autonomous University in Barcelona. And this is sort of a model of epistemological complexity. So we're all of these different disciplines will have different models of how the system works. Some of these models overlap, but some of them are completely different. So where do we go from there? Well, I argue that we go to things like multi-criteria decision analysis as being one of the ways that we can potentially not find the correct answer of how we should proceed in any given situation, but how we can put all of the different options or all of the different assessments right next to each other, and then we can see the trade-offs so that we can anticipate conflict and we can. So I'm all done ahead of time. So great.